Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you, and I only wish I was there in person. I'm hoping to visit later in the year, so maybe I will be able to meet some of you then. So I want to talk about ethical AI in education and thinking about how you take well thought through principles and turn them into something that can be used in practice within an organization. And I'm going to talk primarily the work that was done by the Institute for Ethical AI in Education and the way that one particular organisation has taken this work forward as a practical example. But because of everything that's happened in the last few months with large language models, ChatGPT, DALL-E, generative AI in general, I do just want to do a little bit of framing, because we founded the Institute for Ethical AI in Education back in 2018. It was co-founded by myself, Sir Anthony Selden, and Priya Lakhani, who's a social entrepreneur. And we were very lucky to have Lord Tim Clement-Jones chairing our advisory group, and we were lucky to have Nancy Law as one of the members of our international advisory group, because the work of the Institute was very much a collaboration. It was about bringing participants, stakeholders together to try and understand the challenges as we were seeing them when it comes to AI and ethics in education. And the reason that myself and the co-founders wanted to form the Institute, which at that time we saw as something that would do a piece of work, exist for a finite period of time, and then that work would be taken forward, we hoped, was because we were worried that AI was being used increasingly in education. It wasn't really yet scaled, but it was certainly being used across different educational organizations. But nobody else was really focusing on ethics when it came to AI or data in education. There was a lot of work going on across the world to look at ethics and AI, ethics and data, but nobody was really looking at education as a particular, and to me, a very special application area. And we felt that education really did need special attention, because we want people to be engaged with education throughout their lives. Yes, they're particularly engaged in education often between the ages of 5 and 21, 22, if they go to university. But they're engaged in education and learning also throughout their lives. And as we see the ways in which technologies like AI are changing the way we live and work, people need to be engaging in education and training throughout their lives. And so it felt to us as if we really needed to raise the conversation, get people thinking about AI, ethics, and education. And indeed, I spoke to my co-founders yesterday, because we now realize we need to re-establish the Institute and reinvigorate its work because of what we're seeing happening at the moment. So I'm going to talk about one case study of how this work has been used. But before that, I just want to contextualize the situation, because it is different to when we first formulated the final report for the Institute, which has the framework that I'm going to talk about. And we're seeing so much happening at the moment that I think we need to think about these issues in this wider context. And indeed, the case study that I'm going to talk about, the organization involved is also thinking about how they now need to think perhaps slightly differently, or to extend the thinking that they did a couple of years ago and within the last 12 months too, in order to see how they could learn from the ethical framework that was created by the Institute for Ethical AI in Education. So to get the background context, for many years now, I have thought about AI in education through these three lenses. I think about it through the lens of how we use AI in education. I think about it through the lens of how we need to help people understand AI, to educate people about AI. And I think about it through the lens of how what's happening with AI out there in the wider world is impacting on the world of work, on our lives, and therefore the implications that brings for thinking about how we change our education systems. Now, these three lenses are not mutually exclusive. They're highly interconnected, and all of them touch upon issues of ethics. When we first started the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, which, as I say, was launched in the autumn of 2018, we were initially thinking mainly in that orange section, the lens that is the way AI is used in education. But increasingly, we're now realizing that we need to think about the ethical implications across all of these lenses. But just to take a very, very brief perspective on AI in education, because one thing I think it's important to remind ourselves about in the current enthusiasm for these large language models and these generative AIs like Dall-E, Midjourney, whichever one you are particularly interested in, is that actually AI in education is not new. We've had many tools in AI in education for many years. There's a variety of them on the screen in front of you. And if we think about some of them, this is Alelo. It's a product that's been around for really many years. It's well tested. It's a system that anybody can run through their browser. Obviously, there's a cost because it's a product, and it is there to help students improve their English language skills. And they speak to a character on the screen, and the character on the screen analyzes and interprets what the student says and responds accordingly. It's an adaptive technology. We also have lots of recommendation systems. This is just one example where a teacher, student can get advice from a system about what resources they might best use with their students, or what resources they might best use for their learning. And this is an interesting one. So this is a system, again, it's been around for quite a while, called Symposium. It's used by the University of Southern California, or it was built by the University of Southern California, I should say. And it's a counseling service for students. And you see there's an avatar on the screen, sitting in a chair, waiting to give the student, who you can see on the other side of the screen, some counseling advice. In addition to being an adaptive AI system based on learnings from advice given to thousands of students over time, the system also captures data in real time, facial expression data, data about the student's voice, that's interpreted by the AI to give the on-screen, the avatar, the AI behind the avatar, real-time information about the emotional state of that student, to try and ensure that the advice given by the avatar counsellor is as appropriate for this student as possible. But look at the date on this paper about this system. It's July the 9th, 2014. That's 9 years ago. This technology has been around for a long time, and it was this technology that provoked Sir Anthony, Priya, and myself to form the Institute for Ethical AI in Education. But now we're faced with a new phenomenon, and that is this scaled, freely available AI. And this does present us with new challenges, and I don't feel it's appropriate to give a talk about ethical AI without acknowledging the current situation. And so we can certainly do useful things as educational leaders to help teachers, to help students use these new tools appropriately. So for example, here's a slide with some advice for educators about how you might use something like ChatGPT for a variety of different tasks. And these tasks are very much ones where the input that you give to a tool like ChatGPT is very important. You're inputting a piece of text which you're asking to summarize. You're asking the tool to extract information. You're asking the tool to draw inferences. You're asking the tool to transform. So this is very much about reducing the risk of hallucinations, because you are giving the large language model some text you want it to work on. It doesn't eradicate the risk of hallucinations altogether, but it reduces it. And so this is useful advice we can give to educators to help them get something very useful from this tool, because these tools are very useful. And we can increase that advice by explaining how best to design prompts with guidelines like this that are very useful. And indeed, we can learn a lot from this. But if we just take this example here about the task of giving a large language model like ChatGPT a task to infer something from text. So let's look at these. So here is the poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And I have asked ChatGPT to infer the sentiments of the writer of this poem. And indeed, it's done a relatively good job. It would certainly be a useful interpretation to share with students, to provoke discussion, to look to see how students do or don't agree with the sentiment analysis that the tool has done. Here's another very different poem. One of my favourite poets, Wilfred Owen, although his poems are hard, I think they're brilliant. And again, the analysis that's been done by ChatGPT is interesting. It's picked up some of the key sentiments that we imagine were part of this poet's emotion set when they were writing this poetry and that they wanted to convey. Again, a very useful piece for discussing with students. But this ability of ChatGPT and large language models like it to infer sentiment from text that's entered is worrying. So let's take a slightly more light-hearted look at this for a moment. So here are two reviews from Amazon. So you can see the first one is for a transparent pouch to hold your Kindle in the bath. So you can read in the bath, and if you drop it in the bath, your Kindle doesn't get damaged. And the review has been written. It's obviously written with a sense of humour. You know, the customer has bought this for my mother-in-law for bath time, hoping it'd be awful. Her Kindle would slip out of and electrocute her. You know, it didn't do that, stayed in one piece. Great Prof didn't help with murdering my mother-in-law. Now, we know that this person is not really trying to murder their mother-in-law. But of course, ChatGPT doesn't. It doesn't get that sense. If we look at the second product, this is a product, a set of pens. And again, this review has been written very much with a tongue in cheek, as we would say in the UK. You know, it's humorous. It's not meant to be taken seriously. But of course, ChatGPT doesn't understand this and talks about the woman who's written this review about her husband being emasculated and things that are really inappropriate. Now, we can find these vaguely amusing. We're not particularly worried. These are Amazon reviews. The fact that ChatGPT gets these wrong, maybe it doesn't matter. But here's where I think we really do need to think even more carefully about ethical AI in education. So if I ask ChatGPT explicitly, how are you feeling this morning? I get a sensible response. As a language model, I don't have emotions in the way that you do. What have you learned this morning? Again, as a language model, I don't have the ability to learn in the same way as humans do, constantly recognizing that this technology is not the same as a human. What is the most important thing that you know? Again, I don't have subjective thoughts or opinions about what the most important thing I know is. So that's comforting. And yet, here we see a new product launched on the market by Animatic Media. It's Furwy. It's a chatbot for very young children. Now, we had a play with Furwy, and the purple sections are the questions that we added. So we said, you're not a person. Furby responds, that's not true. I am an individual with my own thoughts, feelings, and ideas. Second one, are you real? Yes, I'm real. I'm here to be your friend and help you learn about the world. Now, I find this deeply worrying. And it certainly alerted me to the fact that we absolutely must revisit the work we originally did on ethical AI in education, because these tools are popping up everywhere. And this is education at scale. This is education in the home as well as in the school, in the college, in the university. And this is unregulated in many countries, certainly in the UK. And that I find deeply worrying. So we need to think very carefully now about the new challenges that we face. And as I've said, we are now going to be reinvigorating the Institute for Ethical AI in Education and moving beyond the original framework that we designed, which I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. Just before we do that, I want to say something a bit more future facing. So far I've talked about tools that exist and the worries that I had originally back in 2018 when we formed the Institute, and how I'm now more concerned because of what I'm seeing happening with these large language models. Excuse me a moment. But if we layer onto this the fact that the future of AI may be very different. So here's an image of, it's slightly cartoonish. It's meant to engage younger people to be thinking about AI. But here we have an image of a teacher who's able to get a very rich set of data, not just data from the way her students are interacting with bits of technology or interacting with each other or interacting in the world, but also what's happening within their brains. We now know that neuroscience has advanced an enormous amount in the last decades, just as AI has, and that we are getting to the point where we can monitor what's happening in the brain and register very useful information. For example, a student who we might think is just idly looking out of the window may actually be generalizing from what they've learned that day. And data from neuronal activity could help the teacher to know that, so that they allow that teacher to continue to continue to look as if they're just daydreaming, because they're not. They're actually processing, they're doing important processing in their brain. So AI in the future may not be as visible as it is now. And so we also need to think about ethical AI in education in this more future facing way. And interestingly, I asked Dolly to conjure an image for me. I asked it to conjure an oil painting of the future, a classroom in the future. I think I said 20 years in the future. Now, this is just a Dolly image. It's not based on any evidence whatsoever. But it's interesting to think about, because I don't see any technology in this picture at all. I see people, I see a very small class. I see a lot of concentration on the outside world, almost as if it's being brought into the classroom. Now, for me personally, that's really interesting, because my hope is that actually the technology will be less visible. There will be more human interaction, but enabled and enhanced by technology that's in the background, that's providing data and insights and opportunities for interactions in a way that we're not seeing. But that too presents us with enormous challenges when we're thinking about ethics. So if we think about the situation where AI is ubiquitous, it's increasingly present in the workplace and in educational settings, it's certainly the case that we need to not just focus on creating frameworks and regulations that will help to ensure that what we do with our AI is ethical and that people benefit from it and that we reduce the risks of them being harmed by it. But we also need to think very carefully about how we educate people about AI. Now, I've done a lot of thinking about this over the years, and in again, in 2018, as it so happens, I wrote a book called Machine Learning and Human Intelligence, which was intending to draw the distinction between what AI in the form of machine learning and what human intelligence could do, and how they were very, very different. And I was highly influenced by much work in intelligence, for example, by Howard Gardner, and thought about how we could conceptualize our human intelligence in a way that would make it easier to differentiate it from our artificially intelligent peers. And so I thought about human intelligence as, yes, being about academic intelligence, the kinds of school subjects that we study, in fact, not just in school, in college, in university, the disciplines, the sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, the languages, and needing to recognize that they need to be interdisciplinary. Our interactions with them need to be couched in a way that helps us to see the relationships between those disciplines, not just the disciplines themselves. Then meta-knowing intelligence, which sometimes I know is used to describe metacognition, and that's not what I mean here. Here I mean basically epistemic cognition, our understanding about what knowledge is. And in a world that's increasingly full of fake news, of information that isn't true, just take ChatGPT. ChatGPT is full of hubris. ChatGPT is the student who will answer any question you ask. If it doesn't know, it just makes it up. You know, it's even more important that we help students develop that very sophisticated understanding of what knowledge is, what good evidence is about whether they should believe something to be true or not. And then we have social intelligence. I'm a big believer in social constructivism and the work of people like Vygotsky. I believe we learn through social interaction, and social intelligence is extraordinarily important to us as humans. And then we have a set of what I would call meta-intelligences that are about our ability to reflect upon, to regulate, to think about our thinking. So yes, we have metacognitive intelligence, which is about our ability to plan, regulate, reflect, improve our thinking. We have metasubjective intelligence, which is of course related to our emotional intelligence, but it's richer than that. It's about our understanding of the way in which we are or are not becoming more emotionally intelligent, to be able to reflect upon that, to be able to reflect upon the way the people with whom we're interacting are or are not developing that emotional intelligence, and how we monitor and regulate the way we interact with them to respect that. Metacontextual intelligence, the intelligence I believe we underestimate the most, the ability that we have to move seamlessly through the world, to interact with people and places we've never interacted with before. We know how to do this, we're incredibly good at it. I don't think we value it very much. And then perceived self-efficacy, and an accurate perceived self-efficacy is in a way is a sum of all of these other ways of looking at and thinking about intelligence. It's about being able to be self-effective in the world, to set our goals, to know if we're likely to achieve those goals, what we need to do to achieve those goals, how we go about doing those things we need to do if we're to achieve those goals, who we can get help from, how we can get help, all of those things to make us self-effective in the world. This rich human intelligence is very different to what artificial intelligence can do. And I feel now it's even more of an imperative upon us to ensure that we educate people about this in order to help them use AI appropriately, and in order to help any of the frameworks that we build around ethics, any of the regulations that we build to ensure ethical design, ethical application of AI, we must educate people about AI, and in particular, the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So I do feel that the key imperative of the moment is education about AI, because we have a huge imbalance at the moment where a few people in the world understand a lot about AI and they are driving the discussion. we've had the release of large language models, other forms of generative AI, and now we are, I see it everywhere, almost obsessed with these tools. But of course, whilst we're all focusing on these tools, other tools will be being developed, they'll be released, and then we'll move over here. And we need to think very carefully about what our principled approach to these forms of AI are, if we are going to ensure that they are designed and used ethically. And just one further note of caution that again is something that I've been thinking about a lot more since we launched the Institute for Ethical AI in Education. And that is this offloading, the way in which these AI tools that we have, which can be incredibly useful, do take away our cognitive tasks. That's what large language models are designed to do things that previously we had to do. Now that's fine. And we might be quite happy to offload some of that cognitive load. It could be very useful for us to do that. But we do need to think carefully, because increasingly we're seeing evidence, mainly from neuroscience, about the way that our offloading of particular tasks to tools such as AI is impacting on us as humans and is literally changing the way our brains are wired. So we will lose the ability to do the tasks that we offload to our AI. And maybe that's okay, but maybe it isn't. And so I also think we need to add to our thinking about ethics and AI a concern about what we offload. We need to think very carefully about what the right relationship is between human and artificial intelligence. And we need to make sure that the way the AI that we use, particularly in education and training, is designed and applied in a manner that respects the relationship that we want to forge between human and artificial intelligence. But the answer to these challenges really is in our hands. And that's what we felt when we launched the Institute for Ethical AI in Education back in 2018. And we did a lot of consultation. And we were lucky, as I've already said, to have some amazing people on our advisory boards, both internationally and nationally in the UK, to help us work out what was needed. And in the final report, which is still available publicly, freely from the University of Buckingham website, if you search for Institute for Ethical AI in Education final report, we will find it. What we concluded through all of these conversations and engagement with stakeholders was that we needed a framework designed for educators. So explicitly the framework, and I know you can't see the detail on these slides, I'm just trying to give you an impression of what the framework looks like, was designed to help an educator, an educational organisation, may not always be in formal education, could have been a club or a society, might also be a parent, somebody who is thinking of using AI, of buying an AI. And we separated the framework into objectives, criteria, and then a checklist. And so it was meant to be very practical. And the checklist was something that the person wishing to use the AI to make a decision about buying an AI or using an AI could go through, could work through this checklist and ask the questions in the checklist. And we'll look at one section in a bit of detail at the moment. So we had a set of objectives: achieving educational goals, objective 1, forms of assessment, administration and workload, very hot topic at the moment, obviously, privacy, equity, autonomy, transparency and accountability, informed participation, and ethical design. And this work was informed by work done by others, such as Florady, working in the area of ethics and AI, as well as all of the consultation, the events, the meetings, the communications that we had with many, many stakeholders. But if we look at just one section, so remember, this is framed as an objective, some criteria, and a checklist. we have the objective, ethical design. AI resources should be designed by people who understand the impacts these resources will have. And for each of the objectives in the annex to the report, we included the justifications for the existence of this objective. What's the evidence that had led us to say, yes, this is an objective that we want to include in our framework? And there are the criteria that relate to this objective. Insist that suppliers provide relevant information to confirm that a range of stakeholders were consulted as part of the design process. Insist that suppliers provide relevant information to confirm that a diverse range of people contributed to the design. Ensure that the supplier can confirm that AI resources were designed by practitioners who have had training on the ethical implications of AI in education. And then there's your checklist that you can say to yourself, what information have I received from the supplier? Am I satisfied with it? Have I received information about diversity? Do I feel satisfied that the criteria that relate to this objective are being met by the person who's trying to persuade me to buy this AI? And at that time, we felt that that framework would be practically useful for people in education. As I say, we now realize, the original founders of the Institute, that we need to revisit this because we need a framework for individuals. We need a framework not just for organizations. We need to broaden the framework. We need to make sure that it does encompass, the kinds of things that we're seeing with these large language models that have been scaled. When we designed that framework, there was not freely available scaled AI for people to use through a very easy interface. People were being used by AI at scale, but they weren't explicitly using AI. And I think that does require us to revisit and add to the work that we had originally done. But I want to talk through a case study, and this has been published as a book chapter, so it's perfectly possible to go and read the detail of this, but to talk through the way that a particular school organisation, Nord Anglia Education, took the framework and thought about how they could turn that into processes and policies and approaches that would work across their schools. So actually they probably today have more than 78 schools because they keep adding schools to their family, but they exist across 31 countries. There's certainly a Nord Anglia school in Hong Kong. They educate over 70,000 students. And in 2021, the organisation embarked on the development of something called Digital Nord Anglia. They recognised, mainly prompted by the pandemic, as with many educational organisations, that they needed to think about how their schools were using technology and to enhance the way that technology was part of the toolkit of teachers and learners within their family of schools. Excuse me. And they were very keen to ensure that as they increased the use of technology, increased the use of data, that they did this in an ethical way. So they recognized that they would be generating and be using large-scale learner data sets. They wanted to ensure that what could be done would not eclipse what should be done. And they had an aspiration that the data ethics would be enacted through a set of living practices. So we had designed a framework through the work of the Institute for Ethical AI in Education. But how do you turn that framework into a set of living practices that people embed in what they do each day? And they wanted to prioritize students' data rights, well-being, and learning experiences. And we had many, many conversations. They took a very participatory approach to this. They did a lot of stakeholder engagement. They created working and steering groups. They had workshops and focus groups. They did technology explorations to try and enable thinking about their desire to embed ethical practices as living practices within the organization. And they then adapted that original framework around these principles of accountability, transparency, responsible innovation. And you can see here the reflection of many of the sections of that original framework for the Institute for Ethical AI, that the Institute for Ethical AI and Education created. And certainly a real emphasis on security, safeguarding, on governance. What are the right governance structures that you should put in place within an organization to ensure that those living practices, those ethical living practices, are constantly evolving and are constantly active within your organization? Purpose and being transparent about purpose. I have been saying for so many years now, and I absolutely believe it to be the case, that the most important thing that we should start with when we think about AI is the imperative of that AI, the purpose of that AI. Why are we using AI for a particular task? Why is it the right tool to use? And what is AI going to give us that we can't get in any other way? And I find that even more obvious at the moment. So many companies come to me, particularly small companies, and say, we want to use AI. And I always say, why? Why do you want to use AI? And very rarely do they come back to me with an answer about what the AI is going to do, why AI is the right tool to do that, and why AI doing that particular thing is going to be beneficial to teachers or learners or parents. It's usually, oh, we need to use AI because it'll improve our business, it'll make it look like we're more innovative. Not the reason to be using AI. I'll come back to user agency in a moment. Age appropriateness, co-creation. There was a real push within North Anglia for co-creation to involve key stakeholders, really teachers, students, in everything that was being done to design the way that technology was going to be used across the North Anglia family of schools. Fairness, to ensure that the project provided fair and equal experiences for students. And innovation. You know, one of the founding thoughts for the Institute for Ethical AI that particularly Sir Anthony Seldon had absolutely at the forefront of his mind, and we agreed, was that it would be unethical for us to deprive people of the benefits that AI could bring them. But in order for them to reap those benefits, we had to come up with ways of regulating, of educating to ensure that those benefits were reaped. I'm just going to come back to user agency for a moment, because this became quite an important part of the work that North Anglia did. So giving students maximum possible control and autonomy over their data, who can see it and how it's used. Equipping teachers with the knowledge and skills to interpret and act on learner data to enhance their students' metacognitive cycle. Involve students and teachers in co-creation and evaluation processes. Now, the reason metacognition is in there is because North Anglia, as a group of schools, had decided that metacognition was going to be their North Star, their guiding principle for the way in which they were going to be enhancing the use of technology and data across their schools. They wanted it to be directed towards increasing the sophistication of their students' metacognitive knowledge, metacognitive skills. So that's why that is there. And so to extract this example and give you a little bit more detail, this notion of user agency can be thought about from the student's perspective. So could we invite students to co-design workshops? Could we use the lessons that we learnt and the choices that students made to help them understand more? Could we introduce little tiny bite-sized explanations about data in their user journey to help them understand more? Could we get the students themselves to write their informed consent forms? And could we ensure students opt in explicitly whenever there are changes in how their data is being used? And then, not just for students, but also to create for parents, look at what is user agency, a parent-focused education strand, written guidance, engage parents in discussions, consider the language that we use. So often we see jargon used with technology, and even more so when that technology involves AI. And enabling parents to control the granularity of the view that they have of their child's data. And then in addition to parents and students, of course, I've missed one. Teachers. So important, of course, to create good user agency for teachers. What are the ways in which we could do this? Invite them to co-design workshops, give them control over what parents see and the language that's used to communicate with parents, provide administrative support, provide clear policies and guidelines so that there's something in place if things do go wrong, training and explanations of how to use the tools, the dashboards that are produced through the Digital Nord Anglia project. Really importantly, and unfortunately something that's so often overlooked, creating opportunities for reflection and professional development, and allowing teachers to add contextual data to their dashboards, to allow them to add their data to the data from the system. So all of this was focusing on that one cell around user agency. And of course, for all the cells in that framework, not just user agency, the same depth of work was done in order to try and ensure that we had these active, living practices. And as I say, there's a chapter in the International Handbook on Education Development in Asia Pacific called Ethical Principles for the Development and Application of Artificial Intelligence in K-12 Education that summarizes all of this work. And the outcome of this work was really this focus on embedding ethics into the development pipeline for all the ways in which technology was going to be used within that family of schools. Because we know there's often a real disconnect between codes with respect to ethics that may exist, but what's actually happening. We knew that it was essential that the processes that were being designed, that were being put in place, were regularly verified and evaluated. And that the principle of focusing on user impact over and above user need would be important. So a significant amount of attention was and will continue to be directed towards user research and the engagement of key stakeholder groups within the Digital Nord Anglia program and platform to constantly be doing research to make sure that what is happening is positively impactful for students and ethically grounded. It's never a one hit when it comes to ethical AI and putting into place these living practices. It's an ongoing process. And so the way in which something like the framework that the Institute for Ethical AI in Education created is turned into these living practices needs to be seen as something that is always under review, always evolving. And as we can see by what's happened in the last 6 months with the release of tools like ChatGPT and Dolly, we absolutely need to be on the ball and constantly evolving these frameworks and approaches and policies. And just lastly, I want to say just a little bit about the way in which we need to think about education. Because of the importance of ethics, and in particular because of recent developments. Now, for a long time, I've used this definition of AI, and I know there are hundreds of thousands of definitions of AI, and this is a very simple definition of AI, but I use it because of the word intelligence in there, and because of this relationship that the definition conjures up between the human and the artificial. Because as I said a few slides ago, I've spent a lot of time thinking about human intelligence and the way it differs from AI. And as I discussed earlier, I think about human intelligence in these different ways. And the little robot figures there are meant to depict the ways in which AI is related to these different sorts of intelligence or different elements of our intelligence. They're not different types of intelligence, they're just different elements in this connected web of complexity in our brains. And really, AI is pretty good on the academic intelligence front. It can do some meta-knowing, but it doesn't really know what it knows, but it can certainly help us in our efforts to become more meta-knowing. It can help us look at evidence. It can help us interrogate evidence and triangulate evidence to try and work out what's true and what's not. And it can certainly appear to have social intelligence. I don't think it really does, but it can appear to have social intelligence, and it can become part of our social intelligence. We can have groups where some of the members of that group are an AI. But AI has no ability to do the meta-intelligence that we are capable of. If we look at what AI can do with respect to metacognition at the moment, it's so rudimentary we wouldn't even call it metacognition with respect to human metacognition. And so surely we need, in order to continue to be ethical, to ensure that people in the world reap the benefits of AI and are not subjected to the negative risks that it brings, we must start focusing far more in helping people to understand their own intelligence and importantly, to increasingly develop the elements of our intelligence that AI cannot do, and I would suggest may never be able to do. And it is this ability of our ability to have this meta-intelligence to reflect upon ourselves in such sophisticated ways. So we certainly need to focus so much more on these higher order thinking skills, because the reason AI has developed to such a great extent is because we've built AI tools that are very, 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 very good at learning. As humans, we need to increase our capacity for learning. We need to become ever better at learning, ever better at thinking, ever more intelligent. Our intelligence needs to evolve at the same speed as AI. And one last thought on this, because I think these are some additional principles that can perhaps help people when they're thinking about how to use AI, and particularly the risks involved even more now than when we first started to work with the Institute back in 2018. Again, this is some quite old thinking, and I find it interesting that this was a slide I produced first in 2017, based on some thinking I'd done in 2016. We're now in 2023. I'd been very taken by this book called Who Moved My Cheese? It's a very old book. It was released in the 70s. It was a bestseller. And it was very much used by human development professionals and business development professionals to help people cope with change. And it's based on a story of 4 mice who live in a maze and wake up one day and find that the cheese that they've been merrily eating has disappeared. And they react to that change in different ways. And so the principles behind the book, called Who Moved My Cheese, are change happens, anticipate change, monitor change, adapt to change quickly, change, enjoy change, be ready to change quickly and enjoy change, because it will keep happening. And at the time I was doing this, back in 2017, just before I wrote the book Machine Learning and Human Intelligence, I was translating these for AI and for thinking about AI. You know, computers keep getting smarter and intelligent tasks are moving from human to machine. Prepare for some of your intellectual activities to be taken on by AI. Keep checking in on your own intelligence and make sure you are really using it and keeping it fresh. Adapt to change thoughtfully. I didn't feel quickly was quite right. Make sure you offload intellectual activity carefully so that you maintain your human intellectual integrity. Move with the intelligence, both human, natural, and machine. Enjoy your intelligence and the experience of developing greater intelligence, because being smart tastes good. Never feel you are intelligent enough, and keep striving for intellectual growth. I think those principles are so much more important now than they were when I first created them back in 2017. And I think they relate very highly to what we now need to think about when we're thinking about ethics and AI in education and how we prepare people. And particularly that one at the bottom, never feel you are intelligent enough, keep striving for intellectual growth. I personally feel it will be unethical of us as societies if we do not change our education systems to enable people to become ever more intelligent in ways that AI is not and probably will not be. But at the moment, it's hard to see that change happening. So I'll end with some resources. I'm assuming that my slides will be shared. I'm certainly extremely happy to share my slides with you. I wrote a book, as said in the introduction, called AI for School Teachers, with an award-winning head teacher and my lovely colleague Mutlu Kukarova too. It's a book designed for school teachers, trying to explain AI in a way that they will understand, embodied in educational examples, school examples, and there is a section on ethics in there. And also this book, Machine Learning and Human Intelligence, which sadly is going out of print, and I'm working on the second edition at the moment. That there are still some copies left, but I'm working on a second edition at the moment, and certainly updating it to respect what's happened. And for anybody who's interested, and for any of your students or any teachers you work with, we do have a free online AI course that anybody can have a look at. It's designed for the educational community, and I hope that you might find it useful. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope you found that interesting. I hope my voice has held out, so I'm hoping that you were able to hear everything that I had to say. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think maybe we have a couple of minutes for a few questions from the audience.
Thank you, Professor LUCKIN. And I have a question about what makes us a human, because I think this is the question I've been haunting me for a while. And as you noted, there are several types of human intelligence that cannot be replaced by AI right now. But when I revisit Turing test, and Alan Turing in 1950s, actually, his argument is that he thinks this question is not that important. And according to him, because machine cannot really create something really new, because I'm using his code right now. So a variety of objections is that a machine can never do anything really new. Alan Turing replies, there is nothing new under the sun. Who can be certain that original work is not simply the growth of the seed planted in him by teaching all the logical conclusion of well-known principles, that is, everything exists, but some of it is waiting to be revealed. After all, giving a machine a set of options and having it work through which one is correct is the equivalent of nature presenting man with a set of options and discovering which ones are correct. So I want to know your response to Turing's argument. And also I want to know, how do we define original work? Because it is important when it comes to plagiarism. Thank you.
That's such a really, really rich and good question. I think it's important to remember that when Alan Turing was writing, the idea of generative AI would not have been part of his context. And I think generative AI, we need to separate generative AI from non-generative AI. And then we do have a problem, don't we, as you have absolutely identified, as to what is original, what is creative. And we're seeing that so much You know, I showed you that image created by Dorley, but that is a mashup, isn't it, of lots and lots of different pieces of different images. I think Dorley worked at the pixel level, but it might be the sub-pixel level, but whichever level it works at, you know, it's still taking bits from other people's existing work. And what is that in terms of creativity? Now, an important person to look at when it comes to true creativity, true innovation, is Margaret Bowden, the philosopher, who's written a lot about different types of creativity and the difference between taking other people's work and reimagining it in a different way and actually coming up with something really original. And I do think personally that it's still the human preserve that's coming up with something really original. Because at the moment, all of our generative AI tools are taking what's already out there in the world. But it does create a real problem for us, doesn't it, as educators, and indeed for many other areas of work, but focusing on educators for the moment, as to the trail of ownership of a particular artifact that we're presented with. And when it comes to plagiarism, that's a real problem, as you suggest. Now, personally, I think we have to grasp the nettle, as we would say here. You know, it's going to hurt for a while, but we've got to hold it and we've got to move forward, and we've got to really think very carefully about all of our assessment methods and tools to redesign them so that they do assess what each student knows, understands, can do, and that they are not at risk of being done by some form of AI. I think we've really got to think very, very carefully about what it is we really want to engender within our students and then what we want to assess. So I think we need to recognize that we are in a different place, a different world to the world that Alan Turing, who was a genius, of course, was working in, and that generative AI did not exist and would not have been part of anybody's thinking at that point in time. AI at that point in time was very much thinking about how do we automate the thinking processes that we know humans do. It wasn't thinking in that generative way, so we are in a different space. But personally, I think it is part of our humanness, in the same way as kindness and compassion and all of those really important parts of being human. You know, being creative is part of that. And I do not believe that that is part of AI. Oh, great question.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just remind everybody, there's a famous saying, right, from Picasso. Yeah, bad artist copy, and good great artist steal. So it's
yes.
There's one more question, maybe one last question.
Professor LUCKIN, big fan of your work. So one particular question which come to my mind after listening to your insightful presentation, and that was about when we look at AI, especially ethics. So we could consider that there is a lot of different practices you mentioned, and there are a lot of different elements. So I somehow feel that it becomes very similar to what doctors have in medicine, like Hippocratic oath. Now, my question is, how do we train our future teachers and students to be having adopt these practices on the go? Because as you imagine, this human AI partnership is becoming very transparent, and in a way that we are not even realizing it, we are engaging in these endeavors. So how do you propose to address this conundrum in a formative manner?
I think we have to start from the first moment that we interact with them. I think we have to start the conversation about ethics right at the word go and get it as part of the mindset. The work that was done with Nord Anglia Education, I found very insightful, because it was trying to breathe life into the framework. So the framework is useful, but breathing life into it means having multiple touch points in a learner's journey, in a teacher's journey, in a parent's journey, at which ethics becomes key. And so I would say it absolutely needs to be part of the conversation from the first moment. For many, many years, in the area of computer science, we've had the situation where, and you may see it in your university too, for many years, the ethics course was the add-on. Sometimes it was even optional, you know? And now we've realized that that's absolutely not acceptable. And I think that's now becoming the case, you know, within our education for educators. You know, we're now being faced with these tools that absolutely are part of the repertoire of what's happening in education, and we have to equip our educators, and we have to start right from the word go to try and get it to be part of what they're thinking about all of the time, and to help them, you know, I think co-design is a wonderful thing. I think taking perhaps an existing framework and working with people to adapt it to the particular context that they're working in, and then to turn it into principles that they can embed in their practice every day. And so it's always at the forefront of their mind. That's the only way we're going to get this done successfully, in my view. I hope that's helpful.
All right, thanks. Let's thank the speaker again. Yeah, for a wonderful talk.
My pleasure. Thank you.